Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sheri delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm your host, Sheri Few, and I have another insightful episode for you today. Joining me today is Brandon Allen, Executive Director of Fortify Foundation. Before we dive in, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and share the show. You can also visit uspi.org to learn more and to get involved.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. Joining me is Brandon Allen, Executive Director of Fortify Foundation. Brandon has worked alongside churches and Christian school ministries for over a decade. He served as a teacher, pastor, and consultant, and holds a Master of Fine Arts degree in Christian ministry. Brandon Allen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sheri. Greatly appreciate it and excited to be with you guys today.
All right, well, we appreciate you joining us. So, Brandon, many Christian schools face an ongoing struggle just to stay afloat, juggling tuition, salaries, and facilities. So before I ask you a little bit about how they can overcome these issues, I just want to connect for our audience the work that you do and a lot of the topics that we discuss on this show. So we discuss a lot about the problems in government schools, as you can probably perceive from the name of the show. So we often talk about problems, but we like to talk about solutions. And of course, our mutual friend, Ray Moore, often talks about the idea of churches starting schools as part of the solution. And we want to spread that solution. And your work, obviously, is going to add to the viability of that solution. So can you share a bit about the financial challenges that led to founding of Fortify Foundation?
100%, and you nailed it on the head. There is such a great need for Christian education in our country, and Christian education is multifaceted. If that's a homeschool situation, a hybrid school situation, or a true full-time day school. Fortify Foundation was created and established back in 2019 as a result of the need of seeing schools that have been in existence for decades, and yet a lot of times they're still in a situation where it's hand to mouth. Just effectively, how are we going to meet the operating budget this year? How much can we pay our teachers? Can we potentially give them a bonus this year? Or even better, can we increase their salaries? And then at the same time, we obviously want to make Christian education accessible to as many students as possible. And I use accessible rather than affordable because I think that is a key term, especially as we're talking on an international scale, because there are states that do have school choice options. And the reality is if it's a school choice situation, if it's a student coming in on scholarship, everybody needs to be invested in some way, shape, or form. Until you're truly invested in paying something out, you're never going to truly value what's brought to the table. And so we want accessibility for kids. And so Fortify Foundation was really, how can we strategize a true sustainable strategy to get these schools out of a hand-to-mouth situation and put them on a better financial footing and get them in a situation where it's no longer a conversation of, do we have to raise tuition or can we raise tuition? It's we can keep it the same because we've built a strategy in conjunction that we can operate at an optimum level. We can pay our teachers well. We can offset with any extraordinary expenses that may come up through endowment funds. And that discovery truly came as a result of looking at other organizations, even colleges and universities that have been doing endowments for decades, if not centuries, for some schools. Centuries, I guess I should say century. But in either case, they've set themselves up well to where it's not a situation of, are we viable moving forward? It's a matter of, okay, here's what God has blessed us with. How can we utilize these resources through proper stewardship to effectively reach as many students as possible? And really, I mean, looking at your Harvards and Yales, obviously their missions have changed through the years, and they've drawn a lot of media attention through their endowment funds recently. But even looking at the Mormon Church, it came out back right before COVID. There was a whistleblower that showed the Mormon organization actually had one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest endowment at over $100 billion. Now, there is a lot that goes into that, because we know they have for-profit companies that are feeding it. There's parent companies, there's shelf companies. There's a whole lot feeding into that number. But effectively, through proper stewardship and taking on an endowment strategy, they could, in essence, as far as a base operation, retire and live off their endowment in perpetuity and just continue with the mission that they feel that God's called them to. Now, for us, we have a different strategy working with faith-based Christian schools that are passing on a biblical worldview. And it was understanding, okay, why don't K through 12 schools have endowment funds? A lot of it's know-how. We just don't effectively know how to accomplish it. The legal challenges. There is a lot that you need to know and to make sure you're either certified or set up to make sure that your investment strategy is being dealt in a proper way, so there's not potential loss on the fund. So the legal structure, the know-how, acting as a chief investment officer sometimes, just effectively having a good endowment strategy that is going to create the perpetual income stream that's needed. And on top of that, the lack of resources. And that's a big one for K through 12 Christian schools. So if we're already in a hand-to-mouth situation, or any little surplus that we get, we're playing catch up by updating our facilities, replacing that HVAC unit that's needed to be done for effectively 5 to 10 years now, we don't have a lot of surplus that we can go and instigate an endowment fund. And typically an endowment fund takes a good substantial amount of money before someone is willing to manage it and set it up as a true endowment fund and create the necessary revenues and returns on it to where it is going to make an impact for the school. So taking all this information, the founders of Fortify Foundation figured out a strategy whereby we as a foundation can effectively help every Christian school establish an endowment fund regardless of their ability on the front end and regardless of their ability to grow the fund, because we help schools strategize individually as to what that may look like. So we've structured ourselves in a way to help every Christian school overcome a lot of those hurdles, because we've already taken on the legal legwork. We've already set up the investment strategy. And again, we're structured in such a way that if it's $1,000, if it's $1 million, and anywhere in between, we can help you get started and help your school strategize that endowment fund to get it to where it needs to be.
That's amazing and very interesting. And I think this is an episode that we're going to have to make sure that we let people know about, because I'm sure many of the Christian schools, the church schools in my area, have no idea about this concept and the availability of Fortify to help them implement something like this. So this is very exciting, very interesting. So you often talk about the importance of building an infinite financial structure. So what does that mean in practical terms for school leaders?
Definitely, and great question. I tell people, for the time being, I'm in the position of educating the educator. Endowment funds are such a foreign concept for the average K through 12 Christian school that it's really bringing them back to the basics of understanding what an endowment is and what it can effectively accomplish. So for me, it's just simplifying the process as much as I possibly can to help a school understand how they need to be operating. And so you bring up the term infinite financial strategy, which is something we've used internally for some time now. What we encourage schools to do is to think about their financial strategies into 3 financial buckets. Your immediate financial strategy is just covering your annual operations. That's what every school is forced into. It's, here's our expenses for the year. How effectively are we going to cover these expenses? Under normal circumstances, hopefully that's coming through tuition. And yet, more and more schools are finding themselves in a situation where it's tuition plus fundraising. And that's effectively their strategy in combating the expenses, increasing for their school and trying to pay their teachers at least a fair, livable wage. So with that in mind, it's okay. Here's the immediate. That's the completely understood. The intermediate is, what's the next big thing that we need to accomplish? Maybe that just comes as a result of a surplus, or maybe that comes through proper planning to where they are fundraising to effectively accomplish some project. That could be anything from a true capital campaign, that could be an expansion of the school, that could be a remodel of the school, that could be something as simplistic as we do want to pay our teachers more. And, that's something we're going to have to build into the budget, but we have to figure out what that looks like because our current income stream is not covering those additional expenses. And so your immediate and your intermediate strategies are both strategies that schools operate in, but they seldom get to this infinite financial strategy, and that's creating a bucket whereby it's creating the returns to effectively offset the future expenses of both the immediate and the intermediate strategies. And so that infinite strategy, the core of that being an endowment fund, creating a guaranteed perpetual income stream that is offsetting those expenses in the future, whether that is paying for future HVAC systems, whether that is subsidizing teachers' salaries, whether that is covering just a general operational expense from year to year. It's getting schools to think in those three buckets and planning and stewarding their money in those three buckets in a way that they can effectively dig themselves out of the hand to mouth if they're in that. And even if it's not a hand to mouth, further strengthen their financial position by taking advantage of endowment and what it can create for their schools.
Wow. So that again is another wow. I'm sorry, but I'm really impressed with this strategy, and it kind of reminds me of how I taught my children when they're young about money. They would get allowance, and they had three buckets too. Some for God, some to spend, and some to save. So yeah, it's kind of a similar strategy, and very fascinating. So, the COVID pandemic was a turning point for a lot of ministries and schools. And so, how did that crisis shape your vision for helping schools become more financially secure?
Incidentally, and I just let the cat out of the bag a little earlier, our foundation, Fortify Foundation, was established in 2019. So from it was very, very intriguing at the time. From when we would have liked to have started would have been 30 years ago, because we would obviously be that much further in helping Christian schools get to where they need to be today. But 2020, as for every school as well as our organization, it was not a growth year, but it was a good year for perspective, because it truly showed Christian schools how vulnerable we actually are. And Christian schools all across the U.S. were, is this it? Are we going to have to close our doors? And unfortunately, there were a good handful across the U.S. that did have to close their doors. But many, many others were truly wondering, how are we going to pay our teachers? We have students that we're providing a revenue stream that they effectively can't pay because their parents have lost jobs. We're still trying to keep them and pass along a biblical worldview, because that's our heart. And we know this is just a unique season, something that our country really had not experienced before. So it wasn't a growth year for Fortify Foundation, but coming out of the pandemic, it really helped schools understand the need for something like an endowment fund to help them weather an economic storm that may happen in the future.
Okay, so I am intrigued also by the fact that you only began in 2019. What an amazing timing. I mean, as far as what was happening um, in the world at that time and what took place after that, and God's perfect timing, I would think, even though you would have liked for it to have been sooner. So, Brandon, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, I want to ask you about how Fortify Foundation helps private school administrators by simplifying their endowment process. Don't go away. We'll be right back with more from Brandon Allen right after this. Government-enabled school choice is becoming all the rage. U.S. Parents Involved in Education's mission is to empower parents. That is why U.S. PI opposes government-funded school choice and advocates for parental choice, free from government regulation. When government money follows the child, regulation follows the money, and regulation forces all school alternatives to comply with government mandates. In this Trojan horse-like model, the only choice is which government-regulated school children will attend, which is no choice at all. True parental choice can be enabled only by an unrestricted tax credit earned by simply checking a box that reads, "My child does not attend public school." As of today, federal child tax credits already carry no rules or regulations, and parents can use these funds as they see fit. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm speaking with Brandon Allen, Executive Director of Fortify Foundation. A lot of school administrators feel overwhelmed by the idea of managing endowments or long-term investment strategies. So how does Fortify simplify that process for them, Brandon?
We take on what's called a component fund strategy. It's something very, very unique. The typical community foundation, even foundations like National Christian Foundation, they tend to focus more on the donor side. And what I mean by that is they take a DAF strategy, donor advised fund. So it's in essence a platform whereby philanthropists can park their money, have that money invested, and then over time they can grant money to various institutions from that. Well, we're specifically designed for Christian schools, so there's not really a need for a DAF strategy. We take a component fund strategy. It's something that I'm not aware of any other foundations out there doing. It's very, very unique. But to answer your question, that component fund strategy is key in simplifying the process. And that goes to every school having the ability to start comes and stems from the component fund strategy. And basically, rather than any one school trying to get started in endowment and having to wait years and years to create a snowball and build a fund that's large enough to even get started in endowment when they're, again, struggling often just to meet their own expenses. The component fund is basically we're putting everything under the umbrella of Fortify Foundation, and we're able to mimic a high institutional strategy from day one. So each school or donor that sets up an endowment fund on behalf of a school, it's for all intents and purposes still their fund with their intents, but it's managed in a pooled fund. So if, the way I like to pitch it to schools, it's yet to happen. And we work with schools as small as 37 students, with schools as large as 3,000 students, and everywhere in between. I've yet to come across a school that can just drop $1 million in starting an endowment fund. And I tell people, if you think about 50 schools that had the capacity miraculously to drop $1 million to start their fund, they still would be starting at a $1 million increment. And really, from an investment strategy, there's still minimal diversification that they can take advantage of with $1 million. And that's a lot of money to the average Christian school, and yet you say you're barely just getting started. However, under the umbrella of Fortify Foundation, those 50 schools, if they set up an endowment fund at Fortify Foundation, it now becomes a $50 million fund. Now we're able to diversify, and as you asked in your question, simplifying the process and managing the endowments, because it is something that is an overwhelming strategy that truly the average Christian school doesn't even have the capacity to take on without hiring an outside chief investment office. So we give them the ability to get started. They're coming in, they're invested at a larger rate than what they can accomplish on their own. And what that allows us to do is generate greater returns with lower fees. Behind the scenes, we have a wealth manager, UBS, one of the world's largest wealth managers, that actually manages the fund for Fortify Foundation. And incidentally, it would be $1 million for them to consider the management of your fund. Again, average Christian school can't accomplish that. So we're giving them that level of investment strategy from day one. On top of that, if you had $1 million with UBS, you'd be looking on average between a 2 and 2.25% fee rate. We cut that in half. Depending on how a school is willing to structure their fund, our fees start between 0.75 and 1% fee rate. So extremely, extremely low. Being a nonprofit, our aim is to maximize the benefits back to Christian schools. So it is overwhelming. It is a different concept, and the average Christian school isn't aware. And even those that have board members that, you have your classic accountants, you have your financial planners, maybe even an attorney on there, most aren't specializing or handling endowments. And so there's a level of understanding when it comes to investment, but there's not the understanding as to a proper strategy and what the legal requirements are in that investment strategy to effectively make it happen. So Fortify Foundation has created a platform, again, to make it possible for every Christian school to get started.
I am very impressed, and I would even venture to say that many of the leaders in these Christian schools probably don't even have a great handle on investment strategy. So the wealth of knowledge that you can bring to the leadership of a Christian school and what you have to offer with the combined strategy, it's a wonderful concept, and I can see where it would be successful. And what a wonderful thing, especially that you're a nonprofit. I mean, how many endowment type organizations are nonprofit? Probably zero. So good on you. That's wonderful work that you're doing. So at the heart of your mission is the Great Commission, training up the next generation for Christ. So how does financial security help schools fulfill their spiritual mission more effectively?
I actually just finished an article that I think addresses this really well. What I propose in this article, and we have a magazine that goes out to effectively every Christian school that we could find throughout the United States. It's called Fortify Insights, and so we market directly to Christian schools. And our focus is creating a sustainable strategy. In this article, I propose 5 areas that schools need to be aiming for to develop this sustainable strategy. A truly sustainable school is, first off, independent. That's huge. I know that's something that you hear on this podcast as well as a number of your friends talk about. Independent. Next off is efficient. Okay, that's another key area. Resilient. This goes back to COVID. Benevolent, which I know is the heart of every administrator, to reach as many students as possible. And then in all of those, not in sacrificing anything, we also want to be excellent as well. So as we talk about financial securities, we talk about helping schools fulfill their spiritual mission. This is what we're aiming for, is for them to be able to maintain their independence. And, this was you brought up COVID a little earlier. This was a big question for schools when you started talking about things like PPP and ERC and things of that nature that transparently some schools wouldn't have survived without, but it was a true battle. What strings are attached? Is this something that is going to come back and bite us in the future, or is this something that, we can truly utilize? And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But as we're talking about independence, schools were not structured in such a way that they could maintain their independence through that period of time. Many would have had to close their doors. Efficient. We want to do things as efficient as possible. We don't want to be wasteful. And a lot of schools, when we get in a situation where we're in a financial bind, we go through a process of cutting, and it's great to cut out the fat from the business, so to speak. At the same time, if we're cutting the essentials, the areas that allow us to perform with excellence, then we're not doing our job well there either. And yet some schools have had to do that to effectively keep their doors open. Benevolence. It's hopefully every Christian school out there has some sort of scholarship fund, whether they've built it into their operations or it being a result of wonderful donors that have contributed to make it possible for students to attend a Christian school. that's awesome. But at the same time, that need is getting greater and greater. And of course, the amounts are going up with it. So as I share with the school, if there's 10 students that effectively are on scholarship, and let's just say it's $1,000 each, that $10,000, the valuation of that money today is not the same valuation of the money in 2030. Inflation's going to take a toll. And so effectively, we have to raise a little bit more money to offset that expense. Well, sustainability says we can't continue to raise and just assume that money is always going to be there. We have to develop a strategy whereby we can offset those expenses in the future if we want to continue to fulfill our spiritual mission that God's granted to us.
Well, I'm intrigued again. You touched on some things, and you knew that I would understand when you said independent, and of course we mean independent of the government, and that's why Ray Moore and his colleagues and others like our organization are do not support the government money going into Christian and private schools and home education. And so that's so important. And during COVID, we did see there it was $231 billion that went to the government schools during COVID. And actually, that was just the third round. There were 3 rounds of COVID relief funding. And the third round required schools to spend 20% on social emotional learning and equity and inclusion. And so that's how the federal government controls the classroom and pushes their liberal indoctrination agenda. So the other thing that you touched on that really impresses me is the idea of benevolence and the scholarships. And I've heard Ray Moore talk about this also, but it just reminded me of a conversation I had yesterday. I'm going to be interviewing a former school teacher. She is leaving the profession this year, the government schools, because of so much that she's seen and in just 1 year of working in the government schools. So she's going to come on the show anonymously and expose some of the crazy things that she's seen at a school right here in South Carolina. And so her big thing is she has a heart for the it's a Title I school, so it's a very poor school, predominantly Black in a very difficult community. And so she fears for the students of parents who can't afford Christian schools to home educate. And, because that's the solution that we promote. We think that no one should have their children enrolled in the government schools. So I'm inspired and encouraged by this concept and how you will help churches to build on those scholarships. And churches can step in and be the light that they should be in communities in times like this and helping these families, and certainly would be an opportunity to also witness and share the gospel in communities that you wouldn't ordinarily reach. So I'm very impressed and intrigued by those concepts. I hope you don't mind that I just kind of followed up with tying it in again for our viewers. So we've all seen headlines about Harvard's massive $50 billion endowment and possibly losing its federal funding. So what can Christian schools learn from that, Brandon?
I think the word that you just drew back to speaks volumes to this question. That's independence. Harvard gave up its independence decades ago when it decided to start taking government money. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when is it going to come back and bite you? When is it going to come back and manifest itself in such a way? Now, there's a whole lot of other things that we can talk about when it comes to Harvard and then leaving their God-given mission at the founding of the school altogether. But just keeping it strictly to the endowment piece, this is only an issue today because they started taking government money. Trump has the leverage and is having the conversations he has because of the federal money that has been spent into Harvard. And it's been mind-blowing for us who weren't aware of that, at least for me. I don't know how many other people might have been aware prior to this, but the amount of money of our tax dollars that was being poured into this institution that effectively has the world's largest university endowment. It's like, how in the world does this make sense? And what types of conversations and connections had to happen in order to make that happen? But because they chose to take advantage of the money, now there's leverage from a government standpoint for them to be able to come in and talk about removing tax-exempt status, talk about taxing the endowment. And so I think as we're talking about learning from the situation that's going on, independence is key. We'll maintain our independence as much as possible. So that's going to be huge. Additionally, then it comes down to the use of the endowments. And I know that's been one of the biggest things when it comes to Harvard, is the size of the endowment and effectively what is that money being used for? Because when you have such a massive endowment that could contribute to a third plus of your annual operations, where's that money going that the expenses are continuing to increase and students are still struggling to get into your school? Because effectively, it should be making it possible for more and more students to come into the school. And apart from, what's Harvard set up as an Ivy League with a very, very... They want it to be more or less a closed-door school, hand-selected student strategy. But for us as Christians, mission or covenantal school, we do want to reach students, and we want to make it possible for as many as possible. And so hopefully the use of our endowment funds in the future as they grow and they build is for that purpose. It isn't to maximize our own personal gain. It isn't to move that administrator's salary from, $75,000 to $250,000 just because. Hopefully it's not to build our own personal kingdoms and to build our own personal pockets. And I think that's been a lot of what's happened through Harvard's endowment strategy that has created that as well. So, when it comes to Harvard, just understanding how is the maintaining independence, but how is the money being utilized? And of course, K through 12 schools, we're not even close to that position in our endowments to be able to get to a point of that even being an issue.
So we're going to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you 2 questions I ask all my guests before we close the show. So stay with us. We'll be right back. U.S. Parents Involved in Education advocates for parental sovereignty, but unlike many who support government-sponsored school choice, U.S. PI believes that parents who take money from government programs like education savings accounts and other voucher schemes are in fact surrendering their educational freedom because all government programs are regulated. According to the Cato Institute, regulations only tend to increase with expanded use over time. In most states, private and home schools have very limited regulation, giving maximum freedom to parents to choose educational options free from harmful content. We at US PI are glad to see momentum growing in the education freedom movement, but the current money follow the child approach is flawed and must be reconsidered. Go to uspi.org to find the details of our proposal for enabling parental choice free from government intrusion. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm speaking with Brandon Allen, Executive Director of Fortify Foundation. Thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. Before we let you go, I want to ask you 2 questions we ask all our guests. First, what are some of your biggest concerns about the future of education in America? And second, what gives you hope?
There is a whole lot to unpack in that question, and I'm just going to have to keep it to the financial side rather than to the personal opinion side. From a financial side is just the volatility. The volatility that our Christian schools have. I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we have a magazine that goes out to as many Christian schools as we could find throughout the U.S. That's a list of about 5,500 currently. In that list, each and every year, we have a group of schools that email us and let us know our school doors are closing. And it's heartbreaking to think of any Christian school closing for financial reasons. And I mean for financial reasons, because there are Christian schools out there that probably aren't doing the job they should be doing. And, under God's divine intervention, He is closing their doors. But for financial reasons, especially if there's been any length of time, I mean, it's the schools, this has been several months. I talked to a school out in California, it has a 100-year heritage. And again, they are still fighting just to keep their doors open. I mean, the administrator is doing everything she can to connect with fund donors to particularly to fund their school. And it's not that the school has shrunk so much that there's not still a good capacity there. It's just the expense to run the school has increased so much. And it's when I sit down and I share some simple strategies that they could have implemented back 100 years ago that would have put them in a completely different financial position. And so from a concern standpoint, dealing with the financial side of things, I have to address the volatility side because most schools are in a very volatile position. If it's another pandemic situation, heaven forbid, and there's not any type of financial backing to help them, that is going to be it for a lot of Christian schools out there. And it's definitely going to put a strain on those that may have a solid rainy day fund to get them through a period of a few months, but not a period of a couple years if it may be so. So that's how I would address that. What gives me hope is the conversation surrounding the need for a better financial strategy to overcome those situations to get ourselves out of volatility. And I tell schools, at the end of the day, if they, for whatever reason, choose not to use Fortify Foundation, but yet they continue in the area of endowment or in some other way, shape, or fashion, develop an infinite financial strategy to get them out of the volatile position, for me, we've still accomplished our mission at Fortify Foundation, and we know we are changing the game when it comes to that financial position of Christian schools.
And I believe you are. And I'm going to be very excited to follow your work. And speaking of your work, you mentioned your article and your magazine. Where can our viewers go to learn more about Fortify Foundation?
The best place, ground zero, would be fortifyfoundation.com. That'll obviously tell you a little bit about more of what we do and even how endowment funds work. We have a couple of videos scattered throughout the website that'll just really give a simplistic breakdown of what it could mean for your school and how it could impact the future of your school. On there, we have a number of different resources. If you want to go back and find previous editions of magazines or even articles, you can go to our resources tab and look up all the articles of people that have contributed. Even Brother Ray Moore has written an article a number of years back to help us out in that category. There's an endowment calculator. I encourage every school to go to that endowment calculator and to sit down and just work through some numbers as to what an endowment could effectively accomplish for you. Develop a goal around endowment, and then also develop a strategy to reach that goal. It is a long-term strategy. It does take time if you're just getting started. When we say time, it could be decades, but Fortify Foundation, we would love to see schools build it to where in the next 5 to 10 years, it's creating a revenue stream that is already starting to offset those expenses in a way that it's relieving the pressure and the burden from that annual operating budget. But fortifyfoundation.com, if you want to email me directly, it's just Brandon, BRANDON at fortifyfoundation.com. Would love to have a conversation, schedule a meeting with whoever may be interested.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much for your leadership and your vision and your work that you're doing through Fortify Foundation. And thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Perhaps we can have you back, later in the year and you can talk with us more about this. I'm sure there's much more you could say, but it's been a very encouraging conversation and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Sheri.
Absolutely. So thank you for listening and supporting our work. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with others who need to hear the truth. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, U.S. PI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional U.S. PI chapter in your area, please visit uspi.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.